We'll be joined by 4 panel members today. All 4 of you are going to respond to the report for a few minutes each, if you don't mind, please. I think Victor, first off.
Well, I got the lucky straw there that I didn't first off. What struck me when I read it was actually it deals with the complexity of what I had been managing at the city for over a decade, in terms of public space and streets and movement and place and development. That's what really came out of it for me. And I kind of wished that at all those parties when people would ask, what do you do? That I could give them this and say, we'll have a chat in 20 minutes when we've had a read about that. I think it really does actually capture that complexity in a really realistic way. It isn't a manifesto that isn't actually rooted in the realism of what it takes to actually manage the kind of change that will affect London. And I really welcomed that. I also welcomed particularly one thing which just gets a little mention, which I think perhaps has been explored a bit more, which is the sense of Londonness. And then right at the very beginning of a career developing public space, it was always a sort of sense of, why aren't we doing what Barcelona is doing? That's what I was hearing back in 2000. Why aren't we doing that? And my response was, why do we want to do that? Why don't we actually want it to be a bit of London, a bit of Londonness there? And so it's really good to actually sort of see that starting to be expressed. But I think the images that Peter was showing really show that there is actually a London vernacular that has emerged. I think it is actually in some ways done unconsciously, subconsciously. But also there are areas where it has been codified. But I think you can sort of see from those that those images of place, where perhaps the buildings don't speak necessarily of a sense of Londonness, but the spaces and the streets do. And I think it's really important that moving forward into the next phase that we don't actually lose that. It is our unique selling point. Our streets and spaces, green spaces and busy streets. London is busy, it will always be busy, and we need to, I think, embrace that through a sense of Londonness. I was brought up abroad, and my view of London was really by what I saw on the TV and in movies around the world, as my father sort of moved us from place to place because he was in the services. And my sense of London is really rooted in the dirty Trafalgar Square and in Bank Junction, and actually that vibrancy and that busyness of a big world city. And I think it'd be a shame to really not embrace that as part of what we're actually delivering here, and to not lose what is that essential sense of Londonness. Where I think that there might have been more in this for me would be around the health and well-being and the active by design. And I want to make that the difference between active by design and the active by choice. Active by design really means it really does force activity. And I think it could have actually started to explore some of that in terms of the genuine economic benefits that sit on top of that health and well-being as well. That kind of absolutely compelling case for bringing that into our practice as a whole. And I think as a society, we're in a bit of denial around those aspects that are there. And also, in terms of sustainability, a somewhat unfashionable term, an unfashionable subject, and a bit of denial there as well, I think, around what that actually means and how it is overarching, but it still does need to be expressed, and we do need to be really clear about things like climate change, which gets a minor mention, but if you look deep into the policies of local authorities, you'll see that actually it paints a pretty grim picture of where we need to be within the next 25, 50, 75 years. And actually a lot of what we're talking about in terms of London's change is starting to come into that territory. We really do need to think about that as part of what we're actually doing and designing. I think that it also is very clear that this is about space and not about design. And I think that the best examples, in its purely visual sense, in terms of the ego of the designer, and I think that the spaces that were actually being shown all have this quality of actual space that allows people to express themselves and to do what they want to do in those spaces. And those, I think, are the most successful spaces in London, where actually we facilitate that. And that movement from stewardship to curating as well around it. The challenges that we've got around funding to achieve that are clear, and there I think needs to be a real debate and discussion around how we get that transition from capital investment through to maintenance expenditure as it's seen, rather than the maintenance being seen as part of that investment. I think there's a sense of having to find the right words, the right vehicles for that to actually happen, but converting that capital investment by perhaps joining some of the property aspects of the public sector with the public space. The way that local authorities work, these sit in different silos and different funding areas, and actually together they could be a very powerful release of further maintenance money. I could, as you can imagine, go on with this because this is a subject I know very well, but we have other people who have things to say.
Great, that's great. Thank you very much, Victor. Good, comprehensive starting point there, and I'm sure it's provoking thoughts amongst the audience. So whilst the other panel members present their thoughts as well, can you please be thinking there'll be time at the end for various questions. So I'm sure Londonness and health, wellbeing, funding will be coming up later again. Right, Matthew.
Well, an excellent report. Congratulations to all of those involved in its writing and its creation. Pam said we don't need to agree with everything in the report, and I don't. The suggestion, for example, that we might use bylaws to local bylaws to maintain people's rights and responsibilities locally, I think is rather a clunky and rather uncertain way of maintaining those rights and responsibilities. Much better to have a set of model conditions that applies to every planning permission across the capital, will be universal across the city. But other than that, and a couple of other little very minor things, I think this is an excellent blueprint for the next mayor, and to remind the next mayor of the vital importance of public space and public space issues. Of course, the mayor is just one of the players, the many players involved in creating and managing public spaces. Local authorities, our local authorities in London, are perhaps even more important, and need to be constantly persuaded about the vital importance of local public space and the local environment. And the report is absolutely right that with the intensification of London, the increased population, all of our public spaces across the city are going to have to work much harder in the future than perhaps we have made them do in the past. But London is a city of diversity and difference, and any responses that we have to this public space agenda need to be as well. I was reminded of this myself when 6 months ago I moved 2 miles down the street and became a suburbanite rather than an urbanite, which I've been for many, many years before that. And of course suburban London has very different sorts of challenges and different issues when it comes to public space, and sometimes we forget that. For example, front gardens. Now, we may think those are private spaces, but actually they're really part of the public realm. And in my bit of London, they're rapidly being tarmacked over. So these places of nature and sociability in the past are in danger of not being that in the future. Do we need to do something about that to protect those important spaces and therefore the quality of our streets in our suburbs? Well, I think we probably do. Street trees as well, another important issue, particularly in our suburbs, well, everywhere. The local high street, Peter mentioned, again particularly important in outer London, where our high streets are the main sort of social space that allows people to come together. And I would say the problem of our high streets is not necessarily a physical problem, but is a problem about curation. It's about curating the uses that go on in and around those spaces. My local authority, for example, in our local high street, are about to build a new cinema. you think, well, why would a local authority build a cinema? But it seems to me that's exactly what they should be doing, because they're worried about the high street, people not going there, it really struggling, and they want to draw people to the high street. That will be accompanied with a range of public realm improvements, but it seems to me it's about the uses first and foremost that we need to get right in those places. So we need to think holistically about our public spaces. Elsewhere, I would say sometimes we try a little bit too hard with our public spaces. We try and be a little bit too clever in the way we design them. Again, my local authority recently refurbished a large public space, put fountains and all sorts of things in there, which the children loved for 6 months, and then they didn't have the budget to maintain them, and they're being stripped out a couple of years later. We need to avoid that. We need to think about long-term management and maintenance issues. Keep it simple. A little bit of grass, a few benches, and a cafe is hard to beat, I think, in London. So, some real challenges ahead. I think the report nicely captures those. But I think also the report presents an excellent set of ideas and a really good place to start.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. I did suspect bylaws would come up as a point there. Deborah.
Well, I really enjoyed reading the report, as we all did by the sounds of it. And I really enjoyed the fact that the word movement got mentioned a lot. There's a sort of ponderance of conversations about place and space. And as somebody who's kind of passionate about transport and movement, it was really noticeable that was a sort of new component to the debate. So I put a big tick next to the suggestion that we should have an active travel commissioner, looking at this, the movement of a very, very sort of gentle, quiet scale, which really doesn't figure in the debate about transport and movement, which is pedestrians and cycles. They're almost seen as kind of decoration on those lovely aerial perspectives, rather than they are the core components of public space design. And at present, cycling and pedestrians really don't figure at adequate scale and adequate importance in the writing of the brief for these major public spaces. What I've found is particularly, again, I really enjoyed the fact that in the report that the idea of transport hubs was called out. You'll find transport hubs are designed for buses, for trains, for underground, for vehicles, it's a larger scale. And then there's a kind of the icing on the cake is the pedestrian, and it really does need a kind of inversion, which I think could be really called out, of brief writing to put that scale of movement first. And I mean, I'm passionate about this because DSDHA have just won the commission for the 2-year research project for the Royal Commission for the Great Exhibition of 1851 to spend 2 years looking at the scale of cycling in London and these kind of conflicts, these very sort of nuanced conflicts. And at the moment, we don't have a toolkit for looking at the conflicts between pedestrians and cycles. We're getting very good at cycles and traffic, but we're really sort of looking at that integration. So I think as you walk around these new public spaces, look at how cycles are sort of colliding with people, particularly on CS5, which goes in my neck of the wood, where if you look at the reportage on YouTube of people enjoying using the cycle route as they speed through Vauxhall and onwards, all you hear on the soundtrack is, "Get out of the fucking way!" Cycles are kind of being interrupted by, quite happy meandering pedestrians. So I think there's a sort of scale of so I really enjoyed the word tension in the report that you called out. That there's a kind of idea that we sort of write these reports and it's all very polite, which is what we all want to be. But occasionally there are these really strong conflicts. So I was very happy to see that sort of mentioned, particularly as it calls out the tension that happens as the inner city expands, where you're getting newer boroughs who maybe haven't had the sort of fantastic potential to deal with transformation on this scale before, really having to come to grips with that. So for me it was about movement. And then the final sort of missing component that I'm a great advocate of doing, along with this sort of climate change aspect, which I thought was a good point to mention, is that of logistics and goods delivery. It only gets a very small mention. It's another kind of movement. In the last 3 years, the use of white vans has gone up 13% in London. You think we're going to all this effort to strip away vehicles and private vehicle use and to promote these other forms of transport. There's something on the rise, and it's very worrying. It's going to go up to at least, I think it's 22% in the next 15 years. We really need the brief writing to go back to movement and say what is causing the congestion. And I was really dispirited by a survey I filled in on the Transport for London website about White Van Man, and it was looking at how could we solve this. Could you tell employers not to allow employees to have their goods delivered? A prohibition on Amazon deliveries to your workplace. How do you fancy that? Should you time deliveries? That's quite a good idea. And then it said, oh, maybe there could be sort of greener delivery systems for which the person who is ordering the goods would pay a premium. That's completely wrong. We have to look at why necessity and desire informs all of these decisions and impacts on our public spaces. I think anybody who pays to have something delivered, but would advocate that they don't mind their delivery taking a little bit longer if it went to a local logistics hub and it was delivered by cargo bike, they should get a discount, not be punished or fined or charged for making that choices. So I think there's a missing ingredient in the brief writing that adds to public space logistics.
Great, thank you very much, Deborah. And reminding us that the public realm is, after all, a very congested and contested area, which we need to deal with. Noel.
And finally, everything's been said, of course. That's always the problem of being a listener. That's kind of how that is. But maybe that's the point I want to make, is I would argue, as President of the Landscape Institute, this is a conversation that was very well rehearsed by us. Decades we've probably been talking about public specs, and to be able to come here to an audience of probably not so many landscape architects and a lot of other people, this document authored not by landscape architects but by other people, and having it articulated so well, creating the best public realm in London is absolutely a priority for us. It is our public realm that determines London as a great city. Historically, the parks were a compelling reason for people to come and see this as a place, as a desirable place, all the way back to John Evelyn, all the way in the future. We are going to see a denser city, and that therefore, absolutely as this report recognises, that therefore we need to see a more beautiful, a greener, more pleasant, and frankly just a more desirable place. This is urban landscape, and it is the quality of that urban landscape that has compellingly brought people to come and live in the city. We didn't live in the city 30, 40 years ago, and we are dramatically getting people to do that more. We know that's the right thing to do with population rise in the world. We want people in our cities. We understand those models of densification. That's right. But the landscape, therefore, is the most important component. And landscape is holistic. I'm not even... there are certain bits of this report I would take issue with. Of course there are. That's not the point that I want to make here, as far as I'm concerned. It starts to recognise those complexities, huge complexities. Space is about travel, movement, trade, people. It's about culture, it's about diversity, it's about everything. Everything happens in these spaces. This is a holistic topic, a topic which is normally, therefore, makes it difficult to grapple with, a message difficult for landscape architects to make, but made very well here. So I am, very, very happy to see this report in place. A couple of things that have been touched on, that complexity. Often, yes, politically we see things in silos. There's the last piece of this report. All four of the recommendations just say invest in high street, invest in public space, invest in streets, invest in, of course. This is an argument. We want people to invest in this thing. Of course we do, and this report says that. But of course the missing part of the agenda is, where are the teeth? How's that going to work? It suggests a task force. I think that's a great idea. 32 London boroughs. I know for a fact that trying to get planning consent in Newham, for instance, I'm just going to pick one out, but I could have picked any, but in Newham, they're still thinking one car, one dwelling, and you've got to have a car, and I'm crippling my open spaces because I've got to put cars all over it. Another London borough would say, that's absolutely fine, 0 cars, absolutely fine by me. So there's huge issues. I mean, I could pick hundreds, and they are about, so there's something about this task force, it's teeth. It's about delivery. There are certain things that need to be consistent, and there are other things that don't. One part of consistency, again, which causes concern for me, is, say, the new cycle superhighways. TfL are right. Of course, it's absolutely right that we want to encourage cycling. We want to see dedicated lanes coming into London. But we've had letters at the Landscape Institute, and I've had people come to me saying, why aren't TfL what a missed opportunity. Every superhighway that went in, why haven't they planted a tree every 15 metres down the superhighway? Why haven't we taken that opportunity when we're going to make these interventions in our streets? I have no doubt, I mean, that's an engineer-driven project. It sits in a certain silo, it's delivering certain things, and we were involved in a part of it as it passes through a royal park. Real tensions there. But the reality is actually all of the interventions and all of the investment that we're going to make needs to think in this holistic way. It needs a landscape thinking, which is what this document promotes, which is incredibly positive. So back to those silos. The document basically is trying to join up a compelling case for our open spaces and aligning it with political priorities. The reality is it is the landscape that delivers a desirable place. It is the landscape that therefore delivers employment. It delivers people feeling safe. It delivers, as Victor said, people being more healthy. And that continuous alignment is the answer to the investment, and it's the continuation of that conversation going forward, which is what I'm really looking forward to. So the fourth document that's coming up is the shaping piece. And you touched on that as perhaps where we're going to talk about how does the master plan work, what are the mechanics of doing this. That is a really important piece. Because this document is a little bit silent about the team, I await that document with great anticipation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that, and thank you very much for being the last person to neatly round it off and draw it straight back to Peter in terms of a response. Any comments from that?
Well, I'm obviously very pleased that all the panelists have welcomed it so warmly. I think that all the points are well made in terms of maybe our missions and things that we could have done more of. But we did want to have a document that was, while being comprehensive, was also comprehensible and was brief enough to really impact on policy makers in the next administration. I think key issues like sustainability, which links into a whole series of points made by because sustainability of streets, the implication of putting more SUDs. SUDs could be built into cycle superhighways, SUDs related to front gardens, all those sorts of things. I mean, I think it's dreadful that we don't actually have. I personally think we didn't put enough about it in the report. Maybe we should have done more about SUDs and how that is rolled out across London. But that's, I think, one of the reasons why we have a number of policies in there which do actually allow those things to be carried out. So having a group which will then get together and look at this in a coherent and policy-related basis, I think, is important to deliver. Just the sort of complexity that everyone talks about is also they also mentioned the reason for conflict and for tensions between groups, and how we try and sort out all those complexities is a key part of what our task force would then be tasked to do. And I think in terms of the points about use of roads, busyness of roads, the need for reducing the number of white vans, how we deliver consolidation, how we get more deliveries by greener methods. I think we have put in there the idea of road charging. I think road charging absolutely essential for in the next few years we get something that can actually ration the use of roads over a time and location basis.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. Has anybody got any questions for either panel members or for Peter? There's one. Can you just wait for the microphone? There's one over there, the gentleman in the blue jumper. Would you mind telling us who you are before you ask your question? Sure. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Russell Curtis from RCKA. One of the things that makes London special is the sort of unexpected and slightly chaotic nature of its urban realm. But we're seeing an increasing trend towards privatisation of public space, and with that, sanitisation of these public spaces. And I wonder whether the panel have any thoughts on how we can ensure that that increasing privatisation of public space doesn't take away what makes London special.
I'm going to ask Matthew to respond to this, and perhaps other panel members can join in.
Well, I think the report has some comments on that issue. In my mind, it's not just about privatisation which leads to sanitisation of public spaces. I think equally the public sector can produce spaces which are highly sanitised and problematic in that respect. I think in that sense we need to focus on what Victor talked about, the Londonness, and trying to work with local character and trying to preserve that as much as we can. But also in terms of maintaining people's rights and responsibilities to private space, to public space, we need to ensure that through our planning process that those rights and responsibilities are properly laid down at that point. That's the critical juncture at which decisions are made about future rights and responsibilities. If we miss it at that point, we miss it forever.
Victor, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so it's obviously working in the city for so long, where it really is in itself an area that is like it is owned by a business. The City of London is more wealthy than a private entity than it is a local authority. So it's in that territory almost all the time with its neighbouring boroughs as well. But then within itself, it was always a case of public and private. And how you break those thresholds down between the two. And I think there's been some fabulous schemes across London where those thresholds have been broken down. And they start a process of actually needing to comfort with each other. When we're out on the street, we're all happy that we're walking past people, there's no control over who they are, and we're okay with that. What is it about going across a threshold that means that we somehow have to be very careful what those other people might actually do? And I think it's an experience for those who are placed with the responsibility of control, and that might be a bit fresh for them, and therefore looking at it as a big risk. Local authorities just take it as a matter of course that risk is something that they manage, and there's an awful lot that can be learned from local authorities by private entities, and also by local authorities from private entities in terms of the way that they do these things. I think that what's good in the report is it does actually start to really differentiate between this idea of what is public realm and what is private, and I think that a task force task would be to actually look at some better definition around that. There's a very clear codification around that, because if you look at what gets swept up into public realm, we look at what through the planning process is being created, quite a lot of very private spaces, the rooftops of buildings, suddenly start to be called public realm, as if it's okay to build in a park because it's all right because 40 stories up you've got a roof terrace. I don't think that's acceptable, but in the planning at the moment it is seen as acceptable. I think the rooftop terrace is fine. It needs to be seen as well as, not instead of. And actually this is corporate realm, and it's all good. It's just very different, and we need to be really establishing what those differences actually are. And when something is public realm, it needs to really be genuinely public. And so what happens on the street should be able to happen within those spaces as well.
Okay. No, you wanted something.
No, absolutely. I think this is a really compelling point. I was really glad that the report chose to address it. Public space needs to be public space. The reality is most public space in the present economic climate is going to be built by the private sector. The stewardship of that long term and people's ability to have the freedoms to be able to be genuinely public in it is absolutely fundamental to the ongoing success and the basic democracy. You can't have you go right the way back to Socrates. It's the tension between the needs of a society and the rights of an individual. You cannot, as we have now, have a man sitting in Mayfair because he wants to drink a glass of Merlot in peace, deciding that 85,000 people can't enjoy a pop concert in Hyde Park. That is the society we live in. This is a landscape problem, and it is one that we need to address pretty full on in terms of us being able to activate our spaces in the way that we must do it. I feel that how are we actually going to do that? The task force, yes, we must ensure, perhaps in the planning, but in a very blunt way, that if a private developer is going to commit, as they have to through development, to building a public open space, that they sign up to that contract in full. I sent 2 members of my office out to Canary Wharf last week, well, not last week, last year, and one of them happens to play the cello quite well, one of them happens to play the guitar quite badly. The person who's playing the guitar quite badly is moved on very quickly. The person who plays the cello quite well is moved on, but a little bit more slowly. These are real problems. You've got to test these issues, and actually getting this piece of the document right in the detail is a really fundamental piece.
Great, okay, thank you very much. We probably have time for one more question. Any other questions? Oh, I think there's one just there, yes.
Hi, in your talk you talked about the benefits of public spaces, and one of them was an uplift in rental and property values. I wondered if you or the panellists would like to discuss sort of the intersection of that and affordability in London and creating spaces that are accessible to the communities that live in them.
Well, I think I would just say that in terms of delivering the sort of public-private space we've just been talking about, then there are clearly benefits to developers to deliver that because they see an uplift in value. To be quite honest, if there was no uplift in value or there was a negative impact on value, then it would be very difficult to get them to pay for them. So in a world where we're seeing a reduction in public expenditure on such things, we do need to create a balance between the two, and uplift in value is the way that happens. And I think that what we've tried to put forward, and whether bylaws is too clunky, as Matthew might say, and I tend to think it might be, but it does make a point that I agree absolutely with Matthew, there needs to be a code which is delivered and met both by public owners and by private owners, and I think just the management of spaces has actually been improving. It's been getting better over the years. I mean, I always cycle across more London, and there used to be a time when a guy in a yellow coat would come and chase after me and shout at me and would try and arrest me, but they seem to have stopped doing that now. Somebody has told them, just relax, or maybe Boris does it so often that maybe they stop. But I think there is better management of some of that public space. I think Canary Wharf maybe not so much because they seem to be more security conscious, but I think we need a code which will deliver something which is consistent, whether that's a bylaw, whether it's new developments, that can be section 106 to a certain extent, but not always easy to enforce. So I think the bylaw at least is something to aim at and to debate.
Deborah. Well, I was reminded I've been working on a community-led alternative plan to the Transport for London plan for Vauxhall. And I think one of our issues is there's a highly laudable plan that's been brought forward by the local authority and TfL to try and unlock this awful transport junction of the gyratory at Vauxhall. And one of the sort of implicit sort of undercurrents to the whole debate about the scale of ambition that should be applied, the kind of premiation of what kind of public space we should have, is about sharing the benefit of the uplift in value in a sort of graded way. So at the moment, quite a few schemes, if we're not careful about this brief writing stage, really looking at the big scale, you might get these sort of pockets of extreme wealth next to extreme deprivation. And so I think one of the ambitions we have to look at is in public space design is how you can grade these thresholds so that benefits, like, it's wonderful to see in Vauxhall, since the towers are starting to arrive, this is where we're based, cafes have now started putting little signs out to say we have a terrace at the back. We provide sandwiches to take away. You can see the economic benefit for the small scale users as well as for the big guys with their towers. And I think that's something we have to be careful that we encourage. And I would say one of the key mechanisms that hasn't been mentioned today that has a really important job is that of the business improvement district, because those are the guys who are going to be managing a lot of this public space. At the moment, they appeal very much to the larger businesses. you have to be a member of a bid if you have a rateable value as a business of a certain extent, but they don't really pick up or have any legal or statutory obligations to really go into those corner shops, those little cafes that you talked about, and make sure that those interests are defended in the bigger picture. They also have a tendency as bids to promote themselves through like lots of amazing competitions for new strategies and new bridges for which they don't have funding, or indeed sort of local stakeholders on juries at some stages. I think something about bids needs to be picked up, that they're a really key, fantastic device that could really do more to help affordability and sort of the ghettoisation of public space be avoided. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. Noel, I know you want to jump in, but unfortunately we're over time, and I knew that this would provoke a great deal of conversation and debate, and inevitably we wouldn't have much time for many questions. So thank you very much to our panel members.